guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be chatting through my March wrap-up. So for the month of March, I definitely read a little less in terms of total number of books than I initially had planned. I did have some personal things come up near the end of the month, which did impact my reading a bit. That being said, I still feel like I read a lot of pages. Like, the books I read are rather thick. And honestly, I loved all of the books. Every single book I read this month was a home run, I would say, for that reason. So far, this has been my strongest reading month in terms of new favorites, new series, just so many positive things to say. I also have reading vlogs on my channel from this past month, kind of going more in depth for all of these books. So if you're kind of wanting more thoughts and feelings outside of this general wrap up and video, be sure to check those out as well. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the books I read for the month of March. Starting first with a book and a new series that I feel like is going to quickly become an all-time fave, and that is Sunlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. This book was one I honestly had super high expectations before I even picked it up, and it honestly exceeded those. I loved everything about the narrative quality, the writing, the characters, the adventure. I just honestly have nothing but positive things to say, and I'll definitely be checking out the next books in this series very soon because I just loved this first installment so much. But this follows our main character Sunlin, and he is a mild-mannered school headmaster, and he is from a small town, but he's always dreamed of going to the Tower of Babel, which is this enormous tower that's kind of controlled by different factions and leaders, and each floor within the tower has its own distinct vibe and also kind of like secret menacing backstory to it. Beginning of the story, Sunlin is basically finally living out this dream of visiting this tower with his new wife. They essentially have traveled there in their honeymoon, but once they arrive, they get separated. And the thing with the Tower of Babel and even the surrounding parts, once you lose someone, it is very difficult to ever locate them again. The tower is constantly changing. There are thousands upon millions of people living within this tower, and it's also an incredibly dangerous place controlled by different political factions. But Sunlin is a man who does not want to give up. With this trusty guide and handbook, he essentially enters the tower in hopes of finding his wife. Going into this book, I was hoping this would be a bizarre and whimsical tale with beautiful writing, which it definitely is. The Tower of Babel as a setting is just absolutely astounding. Care that the author took in crafting this magically dark place, incredibly transportive. Just everything about the setting is immaculate. Each floor is incredibly distinct, and honestly, each floor has its own darkness kind of surrounding it. It is disturbing and also very intense. So I'd say that definitely checked all the boxes I was hoping for going in. What I wasn't expecting, and which I'm thrilled to say, is that I fell in love with the characters within this book. Sunlin is such an unexpectedly rootable main character. He's very particular, and I kind of expected him to be a bit of a distant main character. I would enjoy how he kind of interacted with his surroundings, but I wouldn't really feel too deeply for him. But guys, at least for me, I fell in love with him. Just his pursuit, his tenacity, and his overall drive and kindness throughout the story. I just loved him. And he just becomes someone you can't help but root for, and just like the perfect main protagonist. Another element I wasn't expecting to love is the romance and just the relationship between our main character Sunlin and his wife. I really thought that was just kind of going to be used as a device to kind of kick off the story, but it wouldn't really be centered. But their romance is just absolutely so well written. This book kind of jumps from present day as Sunlin's kind of exploring this tower and making it to various floors in hopes of finding his wife, but it also flashes back to them meeting and kind of growing to love each other, and it's so sweet, and it creates such stakes as well. Like, it's heartbreaking and heart-wrenching everything that is going on within this story because of how well written the characters are. So if you're looking for a bizarre, fantastical, whimsical fantasy tale, check this out. It is an adventure and a half, and you'll love the characters so much. It's just like nothing I've really encountered in the fantasy space in a while, and it really had everything I could have hoped. I ended up giving this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was just so good, and I can't wait to pick up the next book in this series because the politics, the drama, the action, it's all there. There's a lot of mystery happening in the Tower of Babel, and I can't wait to find out more. The next book I was able to complete is, in my opinion, like a YA masterpiece. It's just everything I could possibly want in an angsty YA fantasy tale, and that is Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare. Again, I have a whole reading vlog exploring my experience and just the pain I felt while reading this book. but talk about an entertaining read from beginning to end. I read this entire like 600-page book in 3 days. I could not put it down. I could not stop reading it. I was so invested in the tale and the characters and the stories. I mean, Cassandra Clare, in my opinion, with this last hour series is just wow, hitting it out of the park. She has so artfully combined the combat and kind of the fantasy element of the Shadowhunter world with the demons and the intrigue in terms of everything that's happening there, with the propriety and society setting, and just a cast of characters you can't help but love. There's also one of my favorite romance tropes of all time happening within the second book, which is a marriage of convenience. And let me tell you, Cassandra Clare upped the volume on that, and my heart is still breaking from its use, but it just has everything. But to take a step back, the last hour series takes place during the turn of the century, and again, we follow a very large cast of characters. Cassandra Clare, in my opinion, creates her trilogies with 2 strong central pillar characters, and in this trilogy, that is James Herondale and Cordelia Carstairs. Both of them have groups of friends that kind of surround them, and we also get those particular characters' perspectives as well. So there's incredible like sub-romances throughout this entire trilogy that you'll just fall in love with. There's friendship, there's drama, there's all sorts of Shadowhunter antics from beginning to end. The Last Hours trilogy, I think personally, is shaping up to be my favorite one that Cassandra Clare has put out. I just think it has like everything I could possibly want in angsty YA fantasy. It's just so good. The action was still there. There was a strong central kind of Jack the Ripper style mystery at the center of the story that definitely kept me guessing, but honestly, at the end of the day, I love this trilogy because of the romance and the characters and the friendship, a lot of the tension that Cassandra Clare is able to create between characters. I do not know how I'm gonna wait a year for the next book of this to come out. It has destroyed me. This was just incredible. In terms of YA fantasy, I'd give this 5 out of 5 stars. Like, truly one of the best Cassandra Clare books I've read, one of the best YA fantasy books I've read in a while in terms of pure entertainment value. Like, I could read this all day, every day. Immaculate. Speaking of emotions, I also read The Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb, which is the first book to the Tawny Man trilogy, which centers the Fool and Fitz once again. I really enjoyed this first book in this particular trilogy, and it really just like continuously reminds me of Robin Hobb's ability to write characters and emotions, and just like the emotional stakes of her stories I find really unparalleled in the high fantasy space. This was a really quiet and slow tale, and something I really appreciate about Robin Hobb is she gives her characters room to grieve their emotions. She really does not rush any of the characters, kind of working through the literal trauma the main character Fitz faced in the Farseer trilogy, room to explore those emotions and also kind of adapt to them through time. I just feel like she really gives her characters space to actually process what they're feeling and also react to it in a way that we understand. Even if we don't agree with the decisions they make, we are really rooted in their reality, which is why I think Robin Hobb creates some of the greatest characters in the fantasy space out there, because they feel so real. They feel so human. And this particular first book definitely opens up much, much slower. I would say the first half is all about Fitz and the Fool kind of reconnecting, but kind of catching up with Fitz as our main character, exploring what he has been doing for the past 15 years, and also him kind of confronting some of the things he has been avoiding since the Farseer trilogy. But don't get me wrong, there's definitely still action and politics present within the story, and it definitely begins to heat up about halfway through. But I really wanted to first call out just how strong the character moments are in this. I was highlighting this book, just the conversations that Fitz and Fool were having with each other and discussing like what it means to basically deal with the aftermath of being the chosen one and having the weight of the kingdom put on your shoulders. Like, that is explored through Fitz's character. But outside of the characters themselves, the political nature of the story kind of opens on 15 years past the Farseer trilogy, so a lot of the events that occurred in that book are still definitely impacting the kingdom in its current state. One of those elements is actually the magic. So as we learned in the Farseer trilogy, there's 2 types of magic. The skill, which is a very rare form of magic, mostly isolated to royal bloodlines, which allows people to kind of communicate in each other's minds, but also like read other people's minds and emotions. And then the wit, which is more of animal magic and kind of being connected with nature. The wit is looked down on not only as a bad form of magic, but people are incredibly superstitious. And in fact, if you are perceived to have wit magic, you might be killed by the town that you live in. And this sort of tension and animosity towards wit users is definitely on the rise at the beginning of this book. And that reality is definitely very central to the political nature of this story, as as the Fitz and the Fool kind of have to go on a journey to try to locate the lost prince of the Farseer line. And wit magic is definitely very central to kind of what is going on behind the scenes. I really enjoyed this first book quite a bit. I appreciated how slow and just the introduction Robin Hobb gave us back to these characters we love so much. The Fool is one of my all-time favorite characters within the fantasy world. I love them so much, so I'm really pleased to be back in Robin Hobb's books, and I gave this first one a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have another home run, and that is the Sword of Kygen by M.L. Wang. This is actually a standalone fantasy novel that I love from beginning to end. This is said to be for fans of the Poppy War as well as Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I definitely feel like those comparisons are sound, but honestly, I was blown away by the standalone novel. Just the amount that the author was able to pack into a single book, the character growth, the political landscape, and kind of setting the pieces, and just like the arcs that we got, crushed me. I mean, this was an emotional story. I cried reading this, which I wasn't expecting, and I loved it so much. This is a story that basically takes place in the Kaganese Empire, specifically a small isolated peninsula called the Kunsangi Peninsula, and we basically follow two primary POVs. The first is Mamoru, who is the firstborn son of a very powerful family called the Matsuda family, and he's basically been trained his whole life to not only become one of the strongest warriors in the village, but to also master kind of his family's secret weapon and secret ability. And at the beginning of the story, Mamoru basically makes a new friend who's recently moved from the village from the outside, and through him he kind of begins to realize and also question a lot of the information that's been distributed to him in town and in school, and basically begin to recognize that there's a lot of propaganda, both to the political nature of what's happening outside, but also kind of the current state of the Kaganese Empire itself. And the other main character we follow is Mizaki, Mamoru's mother, and essentially once Mamoru begins to begin to question the outside, these two characters are kind of brought together, as Mizaki herself, before she became a housewife, actually led a rather different life when she was in school and is actually a warrior herself. This is a story about family, duty, as well as kind of like fighting and protecting for the ones that you love. The story is very political. I'd say the first 100 pages or so are definitely spent kind of explaining to you the nature of this world. Obviously, this book takes place in the Kaganese Empire, but there are two very powerful colonial empires surrounding the Kaganese Empire, as well as there was a huge conflict within the empire itself about 100 years ago, which is beginning to rear its head again. And how this conflict is described internally within the Kaganese Empire is very much controlled with propaganda, which is what Mamoru is kind of confronting and realizing, and him basically trying to realize what it is that he wants to fight for, as the foundation of his life and purpose has been shaken. But I would say my favorite component of the story was definitely reading Mizaki's POV, not only learning about her past and her fighting and kind of her hopes and dreams, but in general, I would say reading from a mother's point of view within a fantasy novel is not very common, and seeing her strength and perseverance through time, her talent, her combat ability, just ultimately kind of seeing her have this full character arc that I just felt like was so richly explored was just one of my favorite things I've encountered in a while. Mizaki as a character has quickly become one of my favorite fantasy characters of all time, and seeing her relationship with Mamoru and kind of them growing close together with this sort of shared history was just a beautiful thing to witness, but also seeing her kind of fight for her place within the family and also fight for her family, outstanding. Outside of the kind of political nature and the character development, which I just thought was excellent, I have to definitely call out the combat and the magic itself. There are two pieces to the combat. Obviously, there's the elemental component, which was just so well written. I felt the whole experience of this book was so visual. I could see every painful battle so clearly. Just how the author was able to describe this elemental magic was exceptional. Outside of that, there's also a samurai component as well. The sword combat was so well written too. I just felt like I was engrossed in this story from beginning to end, and every component really checked every box for me. The characters, the combat, the politics, and just the overall story arc was fully fleshed out, and heartbreaking if I'm being honest, but I loved this so much. I gave this 5 stars. It's definitely worth all the hype, and I definitely want to read more books by this author. It was just excellent. And the last book I read for the month of March, I'm just going to quickly touch on, and that is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, book 2 to the Stormlight Archives. And I am clearly slowly working my way through this reread, but man, I loved Words of Radiance. This I think might be my favorite of the 3 books I've read, but we'll see when I do get to Oathbringer. But just the expansion and the character development that is present within this book. It also doesn't hurt that my 2 favorite characters are Kaladin and Shallan, and their scenes together just makes my heart so happy. There's obviously multiple ships present within this series, but I have a strong stance for one, and I think you might be able to tell what it is just based off my feelings on the chasm scene. But the Stormlight Archives reread is going swimmingly well. I am loving this particular series again, if not more than the first time I read it. Obviously, the Stormlight Archives is a huge epic fantasy story. It definitely opens on the theater of war, and there's been one giant war of revenge between the Athleki and the Proshendi. However, one of our main characters, Dalinar, begins to receive these visions, kind of pointing to a larger end of the world style conflict that might be on its way, which kind of begins spinning the wheels of the first and second book. We begin to learn more about that particular mystery, and because this book really centers Shallan, who's one of my favorite characters and a scholar, we really begin to dive a little bit deeper behind the scenes of the history of not only the past, but also kind of beginning to understand their current situation. I loved this book. I loved all the different perspectives, and particularly I really appreciate that a lot of the threads really began to intersect within this. A lot of our characters are now in the same place. I really feel like we're moving forward, even though it is so painful. As I kind of described while reading this, as you kind of get through one conflict and close one door, you realize there's actually now 10 doors in front of you. The escalation and kind of the anxiety as this conflict begins to build is definitely there, but it's so good. The magic is also so cool, which you begin to learn a lot more about in this book, and it's kind of its larger range. There is combat, but there's also so many different types just based on what character you're following. So it's just so expansive, so many people to love, so many people to root for. It's amazing, and it has such wonderful character moments too. So don't be intimidated by its size, because you're gonna fall in love with people and their storylines, and I can't wait to pick up Oathbringer. Kaladin and Shallan, I love you. But yeah, I gave this 5 stars. This is amazing, top-notch, top-tier epic fantasy. Alrighty guys, those are all the books I read in the month of March. I wasn't kidding when I said I basically loved everything. It was truly a home run of a month in terms of quality for the books I read. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!